to Science 5, which means that we have shifted now to a new square, a new quartet of presentations. And as usual, what we're doing is we're recalibrating the way in which we learn, which means that we are constantly transforming our possibilities of transformation all the time. And in math, this is called an algorithm. But instead of having just one operator in an algorithm, we have an entire spectrum of algorithmic possibilities that are constantly revising themselves and each other as they work. So that our double-year program has a very deep, layered complexity to it. Most education and most learning has been frozen in a categorical style of instruction for the last 2,500 years. The number one beginning of subject education has always been pointed to in the West as Aristotle, that you will master a subject for instruction and you will be able to then be tested on how well you received that instruction and how well you have understood that subject. Anyone who has been through a school system anywhere in the world knows that that is a writing on the sand. If you can remember even 5% of what you learned 5 years later, is extraordinary unless you use it all the time. For instance, when I was in high school, I was the best Latin student in the high school. I could translate instantly reading the most sophisticated Roman writers like Tacitus. I can't read Latin today because of having not used it very much. And so the memory retention goes. Subject learning is a false categorization and does not work. It only has an impress as long as you keep reinforcing it. And so it's a reinforced learning. But as it atrophies, as it fades, as it vanishes, what displaces it more and more constantly are the basic instincts and drives that constitute the traction of experience. And so your experience in a very special mode, it's called experience in a mythic horizon. And what this means is that it flows by images, by feelings that grease those images, and by language, largely spoken language, so that the experience of feeling and of images and of language and talking goes back so that its traction is on a ritual basis, not on the basis of having learned a subject so that you can get the ideas that organize that subject and then you can supposedly think things through. But what happens is that this is not just an occurrence for individuals, but it occurs in the society as well. And so the social groups that come into power, that come into authority, the political groups, the religious groups, the economic groups, in order in a cultural way to reinforce that everyone has received instruction, you know what to do. You can obey the laws. You can understand and use the procedures. The inculcation there is reinforcement to control the experience level, the feelings, the images, your language, by projecting down into the ritual level from a symbol ideational level that now is not just natural integration, pulling things together, weaving them together, having them understandable so that one would realize by an idea. Instead, the ideas are portioned out subject-wise into doctrines, into ideologies instead of ideas. And those ideologies cannot directly control experience because they still work as integrals. They still draw experience into the way that the mind now conceives them. But what the projective indoctrination by ideologies does is it limits the ritual basis of what you do. And so if you are limited to what you are doing according to the law, according to the doctrines, according to the ideology, the expectation is well-founded and very logical that your experience will be identifiable in terms of your ritual actions, your ritual emotions. You will have the right experiences that will integrate in the right way and will self-confirm the doctrines and the ideologies, and you will be satisfied. They're right. If you do it this way, it all works. And this, of course, has been forever a target of suspicion on the part of individuals who do not fit in. One of the most poignant critiques of this of all time came out about 110 years ago when a young H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine. And in The Time Machine, the protagonist goes to the very far future, hundreds of thousands of years into the future, and he finds that mankind is split into two groups. A very nice, beautiful, attractive group, the Eloi, who live in a garden paradise and they play and they eat and they don't think, they're just very identifiably happy all the time, but they are suddenly gone before they get too old because they are a food source for people who live under the ground, the Morlocks, who run the machinery and who raise the Eloi as their food. When this came out in 1895, it was startling beyond belief because it was right at the time when X-rays were being discovered, when radioactivity was being looked at. Madame Curie in Paris and her husband discovering that radium was extraordinarily powerful and could change and transform things. And so the very next year, the young H.G. Wells, because he was really brilliant, he was self-educated, largely, wrote another science fiction novel called The Island of Dr. Moreau, where a brilliant doctor experiments with animals to bring them up and speed up evolution to make them human, but he keeps botching it, and if they're not re-injected, they go back to their animal nature. They go back to the instinctive level. They go back to the savage quality. And so right away, 1895, The Time Machine, 1896, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and every year, H.G. Wells brought out a new science fiction novel that startled the world. 1898, it was War of the Worlds. And then for the big change of the century in 1900, he brought out When the Sleeper Wakes, of a man of his own time falling asleep for just a couple of hundred years and waking up and finding a horrendous social situation where he was the only real man left that hadn't been manipulated, messed with, farmed, changed made literally ineffective on every single level, and he found himself almost like the Mark Twain classic, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. The only man in King Arthur's time who understood engineering and physics and chemistry, and so was considered the magician. What we're looking at in our learning is a complete recalibration of the way in which we learn and what we're learning. And so when you look at our material, ostensibly, it seems like the cream of the cream, creme de la creme, from the world's total heritage. And it's balanced between men and women, it's balanced between East and West, between ancient and contemporary, and all through it you'll find, after 40 years, a distribution of balance, but not a static balance, but a dynamic, whirling balance that keeps its ability to function because of a pivotal quality. Instead of there being a point to someone's argument, there's a pivot on understanding all the range of possibilities that there may not be an argument. The arguments themselves may be false wedges of a whole that doesn't have a pie shape at all. It may be a field of inquiry. It may be a realm of possibility. It may be a domain of incredible fruition and exploration. And the better choice may not be to make a choice, but to explore and to sensitize one's sense of an array of possibilities. And within that each particular item and thing still has a specificity. One of the most difficult things to understand in genetics, and this is an early book on all of the developments. This is 1983. DNA makes RNA makes protein. It was a favorite phrase of James D. Watson. He was saying, well, look, it's all very complicated, but the basic thing is DNA makes RNA, which makes protein. That's the way it is. That's the beginning, the middle, the end. And many people said, well, that's right. And so molecular biology, the kind of genetics that we're going to develop, must have three parts. Like Julius Caesar's Gaul, it's divided into three parts. There has to be a beginning, there has to be an elongation, and there has to be some termination, so that the DNA sends by the RNA the messages that get transmuted and read out as such and such a protein, P53, and then it stops and that's it, except that each time the science got more and more alert to what it was doing and what it was seeing and how it was seeing, it became apparent that there is something absolutely magical and mysterious happening in actuality. Because in order for a readout of a specific DNA to, in its double helical form, to the single strand of RNA, messenger RNA coming in, it had to make a specific biochemical recommendation in a nanosecond that this actually had to happen, and then in the very next nanosecond, it had to be able to go into neutral gear so something else could happen. This is a very simple thing. It's very difficult initially to understand. It's the basis of quantum physics as well. In order to have anything be specifically real, it must be distinct from something else which is specifically real, which means that in between them is a space that is specifically real as a space. now you have something which is astounding, because it's not a mythic form of beginning, middle, and end. Now it is a transformed magic form of this, nothing, this. And they communicate. They link up, and not only once or twice, but billions of times. The body is making proteins step by biochemical step billions of times every day. So that reality has to shift into a gear to be, and then shift out of gear to not be, which is not a form of the be, but is completely differentiable from it. And yet they work together. So that the big realization is that the unit of actuality has both a 0 and a 1, constantly pairing all the time. And that this pairing is such that something that is made is not unmade the next nanosecond and then something else is made, but that thingness is an iteration, and that therefore whatever exists in a vibratory registry. Every subatomic particle vibrates. Every atom vibrates. Every cell vibrates. Every part of everything vibrates and has a vibratory quality which can be sensed. And when one goes back into very powerful prayer or meditation or contemplation traditions, ancient wisdom traditions, and they're all different. Prayer is for purifying the heart. Meditation is for clearing the mind. Contemplation is for opening visionary consciousness. And throughout the planet, everywhere, there were men and women who were refined enough at prayer, at meditation, at contemplation to realize and to express that this is a vibrationally alive universe, such that its characteristic is not to ever be static or dead, but to be eternally alive. And so they said we can no longer just call it a universe, we have to call it, and the earliest term that stuck and still in our language is a cosmos. That the cosmos is alive, but alive in an unusual way, because its allness is an allness which is not limited to 0 and 1. It has 0 and 1 operative in its universe, but in the cosmic quality of the universe, which has more dimensions than are capable of being expressed by 0 and 1, the binary there is 0 and infinity. And because it's infinity, it means then that whenever you use a higher visionary conscious dimension to transform anything in the universe, what will come out of it, what will spin out of it in every iteration, in every vibration, all the time, everywhere, is that if you do the math right, on very sophisticated levels, you will get an infinity of infinities in the equations. And this was the very deep puzzle for physicists in the late 30s and early 40s, because they kept getting in their formula, in their higher quantum mathematics, in Schrodinger's wave mechanics and Heisenberg's uncertainty applications and Einstein's relativity math, kept getting infinities everywhere in the equations, and so they came up with a makeshift lens-correcting transform. It's finally, they've settled on the name for many decades now of renormalization. You work the math out, and it comes out with all these infinities, and then you apply a special corrective so that the infinities cancel each other out in such a way that it renormalizes, and you come out having specific information that such and such a light wave is of exactly this energy, that such and such an atomic particle. The electron is 512 electron volts, and that's what it is everywhere in the universe. But if you go into the deeper transforms of it, the electron does very, very strange things, and the math shows it out, and then the physics experiments showed it out. There's not only an electron, there's a heavier version of the electron, the muon, and it's also everywhere in the universe, but its iterative vibration is so massive and quick that it doesn't really stick around too long and tends to decay to kaons and other things. And then 1983, when this little book came out, this is a collection of essays in a journal of biochemical science, and they excerpted a number of them and put them together. In 1983, it was found there's a third form of the electron, much heavier than the muon, a brute. It's called the tau. And the tau particle is so powerful. Its iteration is so devastating that the universe can only briefly not even look at it and just let it be and then whiff it out because it is too powerful. If it stayed even 1/100000th of a billionth of a second longer, it would burn out everything in its environment. Molecular biology in the 21st century is what physics was in the 20th century. But the realizations are so devastating and crushing to those who will not learn, who will not realize, who cannot actualize. Because the more that you hold to the old education, the old subject matter, the old codifications of it, the more the new energy is going to electrocute you. Because those old ways are radioactive, and clinging to them is certain death. Now, it's difficult to hear something new, especially when it's presented in new language, new form. But we're taking two women. We're taking one of the world's greatest science fiction writers, and she's a direct inheritor of the genius of H.G. Wells. She is magnificent beyond belief. And the other is a little munchkin of a woman who's one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century. We're taking Barbara McClintock, who discovered something that was unheard of. No one believed her. And for 30 years, they considered her, well, she's like a female researcher. She stays and just does her thing. How can it be that she's right, that genes jump? That they don't just stay where they were, where God put them, that unbelievably, not only does God have a sense of humor and a sense of play, but he has a sense of transform. Likes there to be variety and freedom in the universe. And so there are all kinds of mutations that can happen. And one of the deepest realizations is that about 3 billion years ago, there was a mutation, not only on this planet, but anywhere that life exists, a mutation that changed the way in which life had been for a very, very long time, the way that bacteria are, or blue-green algae are. Their particular quality of their cells is that there's no nucleus separating the genetic material from the cytoplasm of the cell. And so one can look to see in the back of one of our books, we always take a pair of books. The one for Barbara McClintock is A Feeling for the Organism, the life and work of Barbara McClintock. And for Nancy Kress, we're taking her great Hugo Nebula Award-winning science fiction novel, Beggars in Spain. We'll come back to her in just a minute. And in the back, this is Barbara McClintock when she was a little girl. She was born in 1902. And finally, reluctantly, she was given the Nobel Prize for biochemistry in 1983 because she was right and everybody else was wrong. Genes jump. And in the back of this book, the reason why it's called A Feeling for the Organism is that she patiently worked with a very special organism. She worked with corn, Indian maize. And all her life, she tended her cornfields. Like an ancient Paleolithic wise grandmother, and because she raised them all by herself, by her hand, by her own love and care for half a century, she knew each plant personally. She knew each kernel of each cob personally, and she got down to where she understood each gene personally in the chromosomes personally, and she learned to refine her seeing so that the actuality was that sometimes genes do not stay where they were, and they appear elsewhere in the chromosome or in some other place. They jump around. And in the back of this book on her is a glossary, and the first two words that we need to hear and learn, they sound similar. They have one prefix difference. The first is prokaryotes, unicellular organisms having no nuclear membrane separating the primary genetic material from the cytoplasm. The other is not prokaryotes, but eukaryotes, EU. Cells are organisms in which the nucleus is separated from the rest of the cell by a nuclear membrane. That the cell gets to have a nucleus, and that membrane is a second membrane. The first membrane is the cell. But it's interesting because membranes of cells have a remarkably simple, mysterious quality to them. They're a pair of layers, and one layer does not like water. The other layer loves water. And if it's hydrophilic, it loves water and will welcome it, and if that other layer that doesn't, it keeps the water away. And so you have a cell membrane that has a pair of dispositions vis-a-vis water, and the only way then to get into that cell is through little channels, and that those channels are made. They can't be made by an atomic atom by themselves, so they have to have an ionization of that atom. And so they're called ionic channels. And the elements that are very good at ionizing in this way are calcium, sodium, these kinds of ways. And the energy that likes to go through them is an arrangement of phosphates. 4 of them, 2 of them pair to deliver the energy vis-a-vis making the amino acids line and set as proteins, and the other pair of the energy from those 4 phosphates goes into the drive of making that process happen. So that you have a very interesting kind of a situation, except that as more and more of the work in molecular biology began to come to a crunch in the 1980s, the early 1980s, it became apparent that we were getting into very deep water. We were getting into a time machine, island of Dr. Moreau, real possibility. And that's where Nancy Kress came in. She was born in 1948 in Buffalo, New York. Normal upstate New York girl, went to college, became a fourth grade teacher, taught for a number of years, then decided that she's going to make a little more money than a fourth grade teacher, so she went into ad copywriting for about 5 years, and she was very good at advertising. And then some of her stories started to sell in science fiction magazines, and in 1983, she became a full-time professional science fiction writer. Now, when she started, because she was nice, Buffalo, New York girl, taught fourth graders, her first books were like nice little fantasies. Here's the wicked guy and the princess, and here's the princess grown into a queen. Then here's the man and woman transforming themselves into some other kind of energy being. And then all of a sudden, Nancy Kress went into writing Beggars in Spain, which is about the way in which she says the big changes are not going to come all at once in some big thing. Suddenly, Clark Kent takes off his outfit and he's Superman, but that the genetic tornado will come in little tiny increments at a time. And so she picked one trait in Beggars in Spain. The title is from a phrase that one of the characters in here says, well, we can be superhuman beings, but what about these beggars in Spain? And the conclusion is in here that all of that may be an illusion. The one genetic trait is that some children are experimented with and they're modified so that they don't have to sleep. They become the sleepless. They're always awake. And because they're always awake, they don't get tired, they don't sleep, and because they're alert 24 hours a day, every day, all the time, they learn 3 or 4 times faster than other human beings. And they learn that they are very different. The older that they get, remarkably different from those other people, and those other people sensing these people are remarkably different. You get a children of the damned kind of equality where they begin to consider them dangerous. These sleepless are dangerous, and so the sleepless picking up that they better form their own network, their own liaisons, and because they're very smart, they make a lot of money and they buy a retreat called Sanctuary where only sleepless can get in to protect themselves, because who knows what's going to happen, because the Frankenstein anger of those who are being left behind begins to be instinctual. And the learned temperance of accepting new kinds of people who become almost like super people. One of the most extraordinary things is when you come into pairing Nancy Kress, who writes all about the genetic science fiction possibilities in a huge way. She said once in an interview, Locus is the news magazine of science fiction, she said, I've written 8 novels on it and several novelettes. She said, you might say it's an obsession of mine. Her latest trilogy of science fiction novels is called Possibility Sun, Possibility Moon, which was the first, and then Possibility Space, where she says, over and over again, with more and more realization, there may not be a reality. There may be only possibilities of reality, actual. And what we consider something that's there may be but a condensation of a vacuum in a momentary twist. And we need to really consult with each other in a more and more honest way, because individually we may not be able to understand what is real. And we may have to share with each other absolutely honestly on every deep level in order to find out where it is that we are and who it is that we are. And it might be not that we are, but that we might be if we work together. And that the whole basis of individuality is very suspect, because it turns out to be more and more an ideological placard saying, don't explore. Don't trust others, and don't trust you finding out that what you know may not be the final thing. And what that does is it erases all of the political structures, all the religious structures, all the social structures, and throws the responsibility for community on people sharing. And so in probability moon, probability sun, probability space, mankind encounters a species in the far distant stars who have a shared reality, and if they try to lie, they get headaches. And one of the unfortunate things is they capture a human being who's not in their shared reality. They put him in a prison, and then one of the wardens discovers that he has a completely different sense of reality from all of them. How can this? And he doesn't get headaches. Let's take a break. Let's take a break. Let's come back to just a couple of sentences. And I'm using something from 1983 because it's like a watershed, because after that the complexity grows and grows and grows. We, in our nature phase, used Watson's The Double Helix from 1953-54. 58 is when it was published and made a huge impress. And we're using constantly this Norton Critical Edition, which has all of the commentaries on it and interesting things. One of the difficulties is that by 2006, which is coming up, the complications are such that if you tried to learn by subject, you would never be able to do it. Every single subject now is so complicated that if you began learning it, it would have evolved faster than the old-fashioned way of learning would have allowed you, and you will never be able to catch up with any single subject whatsoever ever again. So this learning is like a grace, because we do not have to stay in the subject wells out of which we would never be able to escape. Because the subject wells now are like funnels that keep rising and growing and becoming more and more huge. We would never be able to get out of a subject to explore any other subject, and there are proliferation of subjects. This was a classic problem in learning. And throughout the history of our kind on this planet, there have been recognitions of this kind of a threshold, but never so crucial as it was at the end of the Second World War. And so a great conference was held at Harvard. While they were holding conferences in San Francisco and New York about the League of Nations, Harvard was holding a series of conferences on what they call general education. That there must be some kind of interdisciplinary programs and courses that can be offered so that people would have a chance to at least have some acquaintance with major things in the world that in their own subject majors or minors or whatever it is that they would never know. And the recommendations of general education were endorsed by almost everyone in the world at the time as being a necessity, and it became apparent by the 1960s that it was inadequate. I know I was there. I was the prize teaching assistant at San Francisco State from 1965 on. Nothing was really working, and nothing was going to ever work. And so this learning was begun at that time to find out why, and is there any possibility, is there any way? And the way is aptly described by a biography of Barbara McClintock called The Tangled Field. The complexities are impossible to separate out in classic subject ideational techniques. It cannot be done. And for very good reason. Not only is it complex on the higher level, it's complex in reality. We talked last week a little bit about the discovery by one of Einstein's discoveries was that on the atomic level, at very close to 0 degrees temperature, atomic structure melds in such a way that the individual atoms all show a characteristic of a single atom. One of the first elements to be dealt with in this way was helium. And by liquid helium, cooling it down to almost absolute zero, liquid helium has very peculiar properties. For one thing, it will climb out of the beaker that it's in. And the atoms do not act individually as atoms, but they act as one atom, and it's called a Bose-Einstein concentrate, named for the Indian mathematician Bose and for Einstein. Even on the quantum level, entanglement is such that electrons that are entangled, no matter where they are, will all have the same response. Their vibration will be elicited at the same time. But in a classic prosaic model from about 200 years ago, if you have a concert room, a stage, concert hall, and you have all the violins in tune on the chairs, if you sound a single note, all the violins will vibrate to that note. What is happening here is a very deep realization, one that has to be teased out patiently, because as you tease it out, if you do it too fast or too slow, if you don't do it in a pace, it's like the pace of breathing. And that pace is not just a pace which is metronomic of a ritual stepping, but that the stepping itself has a rhythm, and that its rhythmic motion comes into groups, into sets, and that those sets then also have vibrations, so that not only are the individual steps vibrating, but the sets of the steps are also vibrating, so that you get a very complex rhythm, enormously complex rhythm. One of the things that came out in the 1960s was a book by a man named Heinrich Jean, and it was called Muntu. It was about African wisdom. And most of the wisdom in Africa is in the complexity of the rhythmic presentation of movement. Highly complex, more complex almost than any other place on the planet. Because they've received a very big influx at one time. About 600 or 700 years ago, the Chinese were having great flotillas of ships. They had the largest navy in the world. And they were not only going from China down through the South China Sea to Indonesia and all of the Indonesian archipelago, but they were going all the way to Africa. The last great Chinese admiral wrote a book called The Survey of the Ocean Shores, because they were not only going to Africa, they were coming to North America. A Chinese stone anchor cut in a very identifiable place in China showed up archaeologically in San Diego Harbor about 150 years ago, hushed up. Chinese influence on the Mayan Indians is not only in their astronomy, but in their physiology. There are many Mayans who look very Chinese because they have the genetic background. But the Chinese took the gamelan from Indonesia and introduced it to Africa. And the African genius at complex rhythmic intelligence took the xylophone and made a huge development, a huge thrust, almost like a nuclear physics of sound and movement. What happens in biochemical molecular biology by 1983 is the realization that there is a peculiar threshold that was being crossed at that time. It says in here, at about the same time that the transforming principle was being identified as DNA, the slogan, "one gene, one enzyme," was coined by the fungal geneticists. One gene makes one enzyme. They did not proclaim it as a dogma or even really label it as a hypothesis. It seemed to have served principally as a useful definition of a gene. It was very interesting that the definition did not arouse the same kind of bridling hostility among the intellectual community of the day that the central dogma provoked. A gene was a heritable entity which had detectable effects in organisms, and an enzyme likewise something you could assay by its function. At that time, there was no general acceptance that genes were made solely of DNA, so to translate one gene, one enzyme into the current equivalent, DNA makes protein, would not have been possible in any case. Then, the increasing scientific rigor of being able to see what exactly was there. When we did our ritual phase, we learned that ritual comportment is about grouping action so that it sustains existence. And if existence is healthy by having variations, then the ritual comportment of the action is complex and not simplistic, and that the steps are very frequently then modulatable in such a way that they can be stepped up into various kinds of order and different orders, so that they not only have a cardinal sequencing, they have an ordinal levels of the way in which those sequences now are available on larger or smaller units, sets, all having an orchestratable quality, so that their pacing, now rhythm, becomes in fact a rhythmic symphony, much like the gamelan orchestras of Indonesia, where you have the interpenetrations of all the vibrations of a gamelan. And when you have that, what is real is only provisional, and is largely provisional in a not theirs. So that when you have gamelan orchestras as the music for dramatic presentations of, say, the Ramayana in Indonesia, you do not have actors on the stage, even in costume. What you have are cutouts of the figures of the characters that are held up so that the shadows of them are on a sheet. And so you have the shadow puppets. Because what you are showing, that what is real is the shadow impress of the drama with this music orchestrated into a cosmic ordinal. And it's apparent because about this time in 1982, it was discovered, not just in physics labs for special research, but in industrial application, that electrons not only come in really strong electrons, muons, tau, and also that there are anti-electrons called positrons. They're positive charged. And when they're positive charged positrons, the protons are negative charged, and they make antimatter. But then it was discovered that equally an electron will always have a shadow to it called a hole, and that one can use electron holes very advantageously in certain kinds of high-tech manufacturing. So things are not just what they are and on different levels and have an opposite, but they have a shadow as well. And so the ancient way in which wisdom was always presented was a hand, which has another side to it, which has another way of being shown and reversed. So that every time that one wants to be really yogic specific about something, you have to see its square, its fourfoldness. And the difficulty is that you cannot see the fourth element of the fourfoldness because it specially is not there in any mode that the other three are. So you'll find in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length sayings of the Buddha, the most sophisticated meditator, yoga master that the planet has ever seen, the historical Buddha, has a sermon on the threefold Gaccha Yoga Sutra. The way in which, and sutra, by the way, means thread, but it doesn't just mean the thread that is going along in an ordinal, cardinal way, but the thread which is vibrant and glowing. In ancient Buddhism, the meditation was that you would not read, but you would chant the sutras. And when the Sangha, the monks, would collect together to chant the sutra, they would hold a gold thread all in common with just the middle finger and the thumb like this, and very lightly, because you're not holding it to pinch it, you're holding it to just hold it so that the conveyance goes through. And all of the monks holding the same gold thread, because gold is a very special metal. Its vibratory quality is well known. Its value is not just that it's expensive, but because gold atomically is enormously interesting, because its transform capacity is almost at the top of the heap. The biggest collision in large atomic colliders out at Brookhaven Lab on Long Island, not far from where Watson's Cold Spring Harbor is. Last year, 2 gold protons were collided together, producing a tevotron raised almost to the next level. And when the Large Hadron Collider outside of Geneva, Switzerland, comes online in 2007, it will be able to manufacture about 30 times that energy. And what happens at that energy, on that level, one is able to detect for the very first time the carriers of gravity and the particle called the Higgs boson, which somebody once described as largely condensed vacuum, operating as if it were a shadow puppet in the drama of atomic interchange. So we're nearly there. By 1983, which is already 22 years ago, what we needed, he writes, and this is Tim Hunt, who's one of the editors and who was a confrere of Watson's at Cold Spring Harbor. What was needed is an extension like this that not only does DNA make RNA, make protein, make cells, make organism. Why not? Is this not what we all believe? Today's dogma? The trouble is, such a statement of faith, for surely it is, acts to keep the vitalists away but does not serve any other profound use or function. As long as you continue to see the sequence in this kind of this yields this, makes this, makes this, makes this, you are not only caught in a ritual frozen action assumption, but the experience that can come out of that is limited to a mythic story, beginning, middle, and end, and can only be integrated then thematically into some idea that this is how all this works, because isn't this the ritual action base, and isn't this the experience that comes out of it, and so doesn't it come together this way? And the classic Buddha punctured that 2,500 years ago. He said that ritual action is karma, that no matter what is acting in the universe, its action is karmic. Not just our action is karmic, anything that does any action is its karma. Hydrogen's karma is to be hydrogen. But that's flawed, because that's not the only possibility. There are not only two other kinds of possibility that go with that karmic thing, but there is a fourth which undercuts and sweeps and takes all of them out of the necessity picture totally. So by 1983, you're getting world-class people in molecular biology who are starting to realize we're getting into a serious thing. Not only are we going to be able to change foods and pets and people and make them into all kinds of things. Nancy Kress said she wouldn't be surprised at all to see pink Dachshunds walking around in food markets with ladies that have completely mutated and modified body parts within a couple of generations. Here's what the editor says. The pleasing simplicity and rigor of the general idea, DNA makes RNA, makes protein, is left far behind as soon as this messy and illogical realm is entered. Why is it illogical? Because the form of logic itself is an integrated myth. Aristotelian logic is mythic. It's not scientific at all. It's not even conscious. It certainly isn't art. And it isn't historical. So what is it? It's like a freeze-dried intellectual karma. Of course reality is illogical. Who wouldn't be? If you can be real, why would you be logical? One time in one of the Marx Brothers movies, Chico and Groucho are comparing contracts, and they're taking out this and taking out that, and then finally Groucho says, well, this one is about sanity. Well, we're going to take that clause out. And Chico says, you can't fool me. There's no sanity clause. Right. As soon as we enter this messy and illogical realm, where the laws of chemistry and physics are obeyed all right, but the system is more or less unfathomable because of the complexity of its interactions. What is even worse is that the role of DNA goes well beyond simply specifying amino acid sequences. The instructions in the genetic material include what might be called analog information as well as the digital. It isn't enough to specify the structure of proteins. The amount and timing of their synthesis must be specified as well. This specification is not made by a simple digital code based on the sequence of bases in DNA. Rather, DNA is recognized by proteins in much the same way that they recognize any other substrate, and proteins control the expression of the information contained in the linear strings of bases. Proteins do not read DNA as ribosomes read mitochondrial RNA. Proteins feel the shapes they find in the grooves or look for sequence-determined but not rigorously sequence-defined alternatives in the backbone, like Z-DNA, for instance. This was the vanguard of research 22 years ago, and since then it has jumped handfuls of orders beyond that. The mysteriousness is apparent now. It's totally mysterious. Life is successful because it can literally feel the shapedness of what is nutritive for it and know it without having to check some kind of manual, without having to phone home and check on it, without having to have some other biochemical unit double check and make sure it's all right. And the error rate is surprisingly very minute. About 1 in 10,000 operations will have a slight error, but there are algorithmic corrections to that within the total complexity of any given cell. It is a peculiar quality because it shows right away in one of the most spectacular realizations that came starting also at the same time in the 1980s, late 1980s. A young science fiction female writer named Pamela Sargent, who was writing her first science fiction novels, got curious about her forebears. Who are the women who wrote science fiction before me, and what did they write? And so she put together a book called Women of Wonder, the Classic Years. And she only went back to start in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and beginning into the 70s. And she found that there was a tremendous amount of genius in them. And so she carried it forward. And what Women of Wonder, the Classic Years, became Women of Wonder, Volume 2, the Contemporary Years. And almost the last story in here is by Nancy Kress, which is spectacular. It's about a couple of people who are members of a group. The story's title is And Wild for to Hold. It's a woman researcher named Lambert and a male researcher named Culhane, who has a shaved head. Not because of anything except the status in a religious establishment. And the establishment has commissioned this special time rescue project. United Federation of Upper Slib Earth, Focus, Anne Boleyn in Kent, England, 1525, and the permit is issued by the Church of the Holy Hostage, permit number 4592. For Anne Boleyn, she's caught at the moment where she is first being approached by Henry VIII to be his mistress because Catherine of Aragon cannot give him a male heir, and Anne Boleyn is holding him off because he's a bit of a pushy brute. She says his gimlet blue eyes under that red hair, both of them do not tell lies. That's who he is. He will not only push you around, he will push himself through you. So she's trying to figure out what to do here, and just at this moment, she gets out of the corner of her eye a glimpse of a shimmering square. And of course, it's the appearance momentarily of the time machine from the far distant future. And what they're going to try to do is they want to identify and examine a special indication of Anne Boleyn, that she has a certain registry of a certain kind of rhizomic energy, and she's very high in the scale. She's almost to 80%, which means that she can be pulled out of her time and taken as a time hostage to the far future to make sure that she's like a stem cell donor for these special qualities. And she thinks she has trouble with Henry VIII. This is how Nancy Kress came in, writing these kinds of things, and went on from there, and is still going on from there. Her third husband was one of the greatest British science fiction writers, and unfortunately he died early this year, brain cancer. His name was Charles Sheffield. And he has about 30 or 40 books. Not only was he a science fiction writer, but he was one of the world's great scientists. And he's the one who did a lot of big picture books on the Earth from space with all of the matter in it. And she says in one of her interviews, she says, well, you know, Charles and I argue all the time. And she says, I don't know a lot of physics. Partly I'm reading, partly I'm picking Charles's brains, and partly I'm inventing like mad. When he reads it, he's going to turn pale and say, this is gibberish. And we'll have the same argument we always have. I'll say, I know it's gibberish. It's science fiction. If it were real, it would be a monograph. He pronounces it science fiction. I pronounce it science fiction. One of the extraordinary things is that women are such an indelibly brilliant insight into this because of their nature. Men tend to be very uncritically comfortable of being mentally right. And if you're successful, all the better. Women, as Nancy Kress says, by the time a woman is 40, 90% of them will have had children. So they're constantly dealing with the whole thing of the emergence of someone new and how they emerge and come out. And so it isn't just about children, but it's about the natural reality of one emerging out of this mysteriousness and coming not just to be, but to have all kinds of qualities and complications that continue to complicate and continue to be a very deep insight, which our learning takes, is to take presentations not in some kind of a sequential order, but to array them so that they will make like a frame of presentation. So science today, 5, 6, 7, and 8 will be a frame which uses the similar technique that we've used all the way through our learning, as to take a pair of people. One of the people will be the pivot at the center of the rotation of the square. The other person will be the angles of major possibilities that relate to that. And so Barbara McClintock will be our pivot, and Nancy Kress will be our angles of conscious possibilities. And by pairing people in this way, we get ourselves out of the funnel sand trap, not only of the subject, but of considering somebody to be only who they are said to be. We are not who we are said to be. What is said of us is so minuscule of what we can be, and what we can be is as real as what we have been, even more so, because there's not only the ability to go into the future, there's the ability to go back and recalibrate the past. I call it the new past. The past is not over and done. This is a mental gagging on karma, projecting out and saying, well, it's history, is that. It's the dead past. Every rock star in the world has the little phrase, yeah, you're history. They miss it completely. This is karmic vomiting. This is ideological stupidity. As we have seen, history has a higher consciousness. And as visionary consciousness was 5-dimensional, historical consciousness is 7-dimensional. And whereas vision in consciousness transforms by fermentation, historical consciousness transforms by distillation. So what comes out of visionary consciousness is art, and what comes out of the distillation of 7-dimensional history is science. And so the arts and sciences are related, just like existence and the mind are related. The mind integrates the existentials of the universe, but science is able to analytically show the reality of all the possibilities of the lens of the artist. And not only is the artist a lens of possibilities, but every work that they make is also prismatic like a lens. And so you're dealing with a jewel, a universe raised to crown jewels. It's not the glint and glimmer of consciousness that's so rare. It is characteristic of reality. Reality is scintillating all the time. Unbelievably so. What is coming in and out of existence all the time are trillions of galaxies, of trillions of stars, of uncountable molecules and cells all the time. It's dazzling. And the reason why space looks black and dark is because the dazzle in reality is so much that our narrow vision electromagnetic sliver makes space look black when it is superlight. But in order to be able to see that, one has to go spiritual. The physiological eye, the universe's mind, cannot see, cannot think that. And so you have to go through a double transform. One of the most amazing things is how actuality discovers this and discloses this all the time, which is why the attentiveness and really high-powered yogas like this one, this is a yoga of civilization, is to realize it's a dynamic genome. Its dynamic carries in such a way that its swirls energize and cinch into matter, which uncinch and cinch back again iteratively billions of times per time unit. One of the brilliant places in the world is the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories on Long Island. And the great book of it, Houses of Science, was written by James Watson's wife, Liz Watson. This building was originally a house for animals, and now is the Barbara McClintock Laboratory at Cold Spring Harbor. The new animal house looks like a New England barn. It is a supersonic 21st century place. Those are not skylights at the top, they're solar panels. It makes all of its energy. This barn raises special mice, special rabbits, and they are all tailored so that they have what are called monoclonal cellular possibilities, that all of them are evolved from a single cell, so that they have a consistency which is indefinite, and that when one then uses that for experiments, one has a metronome which is not based upon any kind of a chance karmic situation, but is analyzable to any degree of specificity. As soon as this was made, this building was put up in 1988. It was a quantum jump, as they used to say, in the capacity to understand. And that understanding showed more and more. We didn't get it at all. And every year has been an act of great humility for anyone following it. It is more scintillatingly, jewel-like mysterious than anyone could have believed. More next week on Our Ladies.